There was an interesting quote that I picked up for the book that I'll just sort of read back to you. It's a delicious irony that more information about the rural Roman 90% has emerged from the construction of Euro Disney than from the well-intentioned excavations designed to find them. Now, I imagine that obviously this kind of culture towards preserving archaeological finds is going to vary across the globe. And I would even imagine that there's even some frictions that exist a lot of the time between the commercial side and the archaeological sector. You'll know far more about that than I do. But in a way, how important is commercial construction to the betterment and furtherment of archaeology? And is there an argument to be made that without it, we actually wouldn't have as much information about these ancient periods as we might or we could have?
So, yeah, I know. I figured that might be controversial with some people to imagine, the guys with the bulldozers as being the friends of archaeologists. It all depends on the local laws. And this is
Mhm.
where France and Britain, I think, have really led the way in terms of producing a set of local laws, which they also enforce, which require not only comprehensive archaeology in advance of construction, but also the study of the finds. Without the study of the finds, none of the things that I was able to do in my book are possible. So these laws exist in Italy, for instance. They are enforced reasonably well and with greater robustness. There's no requirement to study the finds, and there's no requirement to make all the information publicly available. So you got to go find the archaeologists who did the work, and you have to persuade them to share their work with you, which often they are, but then, maybe they handed their work over to the authorities and who knows where that went. There isn't a central repository for all of this data, which is huge amounts of data. Can you imagine when they built the TGV or when they built Heathrow 5?
Yeah.
Huge excavations in advance of these projects. Those excavations were done beautifully well to the highest standard. They studied all the finds, which include, all the residues of consumption, production, agriculture, blah, blah, blah. And it's only with these big data sets that we can actually do this kind of work. So I attempted to do a kind of academic project like produces the data that I'm talking about in Britain and in France, in Italy. And I attempted to run around the countryside and excavate, lots and lots of small scale sites. I mean, I did 9, right? I mean, our team did a handful. We were very proud of ourselves, obviously. That was 9 more than existed before, but nothing compared to the thousands that exist in Britain and the thousands that exist in France, all of which have been beautifully studied and the data made publicly available. So, in doing that project, me and my team were sort of forced to recognize the limitations of academic projects in comparison with a productive partnership with commercial activity and commercial archaeology. And there's been really great sort of meditations on what this means for archaeology that's been done by some of my colleagues in Britain who thought a lot about this because commercial archaeology has obtained such an extraordinary standard in Britain, which is really admirable.
Yeah, but it's nice to hear that we're, at least in the UK, we're kind of preserving a lot of these artifacts and we're doing this kind of research. I guess the counterpoint for that for a lot of commercial industries, particularly in places like America, that's maybe a little bit more capitalist and stuff, is that it could potentially slow development, it's extra cost, it's regulation, and those are non-zero factors, right?
Absolutely.
And so if you're trying to build out cities and do infrastructure projects, but every time you dig something up that you have to have an archaeological finding site around it and do all the work around it, that's obviously going to slow up building and stuff. So I guess it's finding that building between prioritizing the modern day but also it's kind of prioritizing sort of the past and what we can do to sort of learn about it and stuff.
Yeah, I just jump in and say, the thing that you have to come to terms with commercial archaeology is that the thing that you found is going to get destroyed, right? You got to let that go, right? In very rare cases do people halt construction and then figure out a way to preserve whatever it is. So the recording systems are really the way in which the past is preserved, if you like. So the drawings, the photographs, the actual artifacts, which are obviously taken away and preserved. But the site itself is going to get destroyed or recovered, that is to say, covered with a layer of earth and preserved, but inside a building and you're never going to be able to see it again. And that's hard, I think, for many archaeologists and certainly people in general, right, to come to terms with. And that's the compromises that have to be made when the past meets the present. Every culture negotiates those differently, and it's not an accident, right, that the two places that are doing it so beautifully are relatively wealthy countries in
Yeah,
which,
sure.
right, making what it actually amounts to a reasonably relatively small sacrifice of time and money in order to preserve the past seems like possible, right? Poor countries have a really hard time making that argument. I will say, though, right, if you look at the margins that big construction companies are making, even in poor countries, they're making money hand over fist. And that money in doing archaeological work, of course, goes back. In some ways, it goes back to archaeologists. It goes back to people who work on these projects. It goes back to universities, right? It goes back because the universities are the ones who are running the projects and studying the finds. So I think that there's more room even for countries that are continuing to develop their economies to think about um, asking these construction companies to give a little bit more in order to basically support the knowledge industries in their countries.
Sure. No, no, certainly. I think it's yeah, because you also never know what you're going to sort of uncover and what you're going to be able to find that
Yeah.
might lead to greater understanding. It might lead to increased economic activity, maybe in some other peripheral ways potentially as well.